My name's Gregg Ten Elshof. I teach philosophy at Biola University, and unlike some of the others who've taken the stage, I think I know exactly why I've been invited here. I think it's so that Steve doesn't have to be the butt of all the jokes. So I'm happy to play my part. I want to take just a minute while I have the mic to express something that I think everybody's noticing. This is a really hard thing to pull off, to get academics and practitioners into fruitful conversation together. It's a beautiful thing, and so I want to say thanks to Steve and Rebecca and to their team and to the Institute. This is a really beautiful thing, and I hope to see more of it. So thank you. We turn now to a diagnosis of the problem of Christian immaturity from a philosophical perspective, and our speakers are Michael Austin from Eastern Kentucky University and Jamie Smith from Calvin University. Please welcome Mike.
So yeah, this has been good for me just to be here in terms of my own formation, and even now, sometimes formation is surfacing some of your own vices. So as I sit next to Jamie, I'm a little jealous of all of the high quality and quantity of his work, and of Gregg, his hair. Yes. So anyway, I tried that in the 80s when I was in high school. I wanted to be like Joshua Tree Bono, but it just turned into like a really bad mullet. So anyway. I also feel a responsibility to make fun of Steve, but we were talking last night with him and Rebecca, like Rebecca's got off pretty easy. Nobody's giving her a hard time. And as a philosopher, of course, I think, well, why is that? And then I just think, well, it's self-evident. Steve. So, all right. I also confessed last night that one way I feel good about myself is trying to be funny and people laughing. So now that I have a good self-image, let's jump in. This is like... Fortunately, it's a blessing. A lot of my work in philosophy and then in sort of public-facing philosophy, Christian writing stuff, it really is autobiographical in a certain way. It's things that are on my heart that I'm passionate about, virtue formation, spiritual formation, the common good, community, all that stuff. So I'm not going to obviously summarize everything in the paper. There are kind of two clusters of issues. One, I think issues with spiritual formation that are barriers to it related to desire, belief, those kind of things. And so I'm going to set those aside. We can look at those in the discussion more if we'd like in response to some of Jamie's comments. I want to focus in on this adoption of a culture war paradigm for engaging other people in the culture is something that I think probably most of us in this room, I probably don't see ourselves as culture warriors, and we have a sense, intuitive, and maybe even a well-formed sense of what's wrong with it, but I wanted to just try to think about it from a moral perspective, a virtue perspective, and some of the problems. So let's jump into that. And then maybe if I have... Oh, I didn't start my time, Gregg.
Still counts.
All right, I can see yours from here. All right, good. I was too busy trying to be funny. All right. So let's just jump into a kind of a deeper look at spiritual malformation and culture war Christianity. And I kind of took this for granted, but this was actually, thanks to Dan Speak for giving some comments a couple months ago. There's a spiritual danger in like talking about the pride and the sloth and the lack of humility of other people, right? And I just want to recognize that. And the quote from Pascal in the paper, right? He talks about the danger of this, and he says, "Talk about humility gives occasion for pride to the proud and humility to the humble. Few speak humbly of humility, chastely of chastity, dubiously of skepticism." That's a good one. This is a little extreme, but we're nothing but lies, duplicity, contradiction, and we hide and disguise ourselves from ourselves. So I'm not that negative about our nature. We're more than those things, but we do hide and disguise ourselves from ourselves, especially people in academia and ministry, vocationally. So there's a strong word. All I can say is let's be mindful of it, but let's also, if we do care about our community, which we do, we have to analyze it, criticize it, and if we're doing that out of a motive of love, out of a motive of trying to foster character, foster the common good, cultivate community in our church and in the world, then it's work we need to do. Okay, so let's jump in. Culture Wars, right? In his book in 1991, kind of a classic about culture war, James Davison Hunter gives a definition, but he discusses the many different fronts of cultural conflict in the United States. Family, education, media, the arts, law, electoral politics. And this was in 1991. He says, this conflict is, quote, political and social hostility rooted in different systems of moral understanding. And then he says, the end to which these hostilities tend is the domination of one cultural and moral ethos over all others. At stake, he says, is how we as Americans will order our lives together. And I think, I was going to say nothing has changed. Actually, it has changed since 1991. In many ways, it's arguably worse. But what do we do in a culture where we caricature other people, their experiences, their beliefs, rather than having a compassionate curiosity of trying to understand them, where they're coming from, their experience as a human being in the world? We don't do that, right? We're seeking to defeat them rather than relate to them in the mercy, humility, and love of Christ. And so there are a lot of vices the culture war helps foster or exacerbates. I've talked about sloth and humility, or sloth and pride in the paper a lot. And I think, I'll just highlight a couple examples. So I think of, we have sort of these, especially white evangelicals, these sort of shibboleths, right? You have a particular way of thinking about and dealing with LGBTQ plus issues. Abortion is another one. I would say for white evangelicals, sadly, things about like what I would consider abhorrent views about race and immigration are part of that these days. But rather than engaging people in the way love demands, and if we think of sloth as Rebecca DeYoung helpfully defines it as just resistance to the demands of love, that's happening. So I think this isn't in the paper, but I thought of talking with not a colleague, someone I know at a Christian university, and he talked about how often over Thanksgiving at the university, they'll have students stay at their house over the Thanksgiving holiday, and these students they're at a Christian school, they're members of the LGBT community, and they're not allowed to come home by their actual parents, right? That's resistance to the demands of love. And so I think probably most of us think that's inconceivable, and it should be, but it's not. My conjecture about some of this stuff is that whether it's the issues I've talked about or other culture war issues, we often, and by we I'm sort of evangelical Christians and others might fit the bill, but we think of those things as about others, and they're not, right? They're about many of us, but if we don't struggle with something, if it's not something we deal with, relate to, it's much easier to sort of do what we do here and just turn people into targets. And the carnage of the culture war is not good. So, turning to pride, Reinhold Niebuhr talks about three kinds of pride: intellectual pride, and it's a form of pride where we don't account for our finitude as human beings, as knowers, our susceptibility to bias, and really, I think most strongly, the influence of self-interest on the way we think about these things. And so that's an issue deeply related to formation, right? Becoming humble, other-centered, rather than self-centered, and letting humility and love, those virtues guide our thinking and our action. A second form is what he calls moral pride. We exemplify this when we condemn other people for failing to live by our moral standards that we take to be God's and beyond question. Niebuhr talks about there at least is an element of arbitrariness to some of that, again related to our finitude. Look, I don't need to point out examples of that. I think I do in the paper, but we all know that, right? It's just in the polarization of our society, moral pride, intellectual pride are rampant. The third one, which is even more lethal to our souls, I would argue, and our witness, is called spiritual pride. And so Niebuhr thinks this is the worst kind of pride because it includes an explicit form of self-deification, and not the theosis, right, the good kind, but a morally dangerous kind. And so in spiritual pride, God becomes, quote, the exclusive ally. God's for me, he's for us, and he's against them. And so, second to the Bible, I'd like to quote U2 a lot, and it makes me think of a U2 song called Invisible, and there's this refrain over and over, there is no them, there's only us. So it's not us versus them, it's not even us and them, it's just us. And of course there are differences and distinctions in human communities, but at the fundamental level, if the doctrine of being in the image of God means anything, it at least includes that in a real way. And so when I think of the culture war, okay, good, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. I can finish. My work focuses on character and the common good and spiritual formation, and I harp on the culture war online and just some writings and stuff, and then people are like, you're in the culture war, Mike. And at first I said, no, I'm not, but I have books about Christian ethics and guns, an edited collection on Christianity and conspiracy theories, and then in the fall, one on Christian nationalism. So I've tried to think, well, yeah, but there is a culture war in a certain sense. But this metaphor analogy, it doesn't work all the way, but I think this is one that we should think of before I wrap up. There's this movie, it's several years ago, Hacksaw Ridge. I don't know if you've seen it. So it's about a soldier. He's a pacifist, and so it's World War II. He becomes a medic, so he can be a part of the war in a sense, but without having to violate his beliefs. So the movie's about this battle where he saves 70. It's based on a true story. 75 soldiers He goes into the field, pulls them back 75 times, saves 75 men without a gun, risking his own life over and over and over. And why does he do that? He saved lives, right? Do what a medic does. I think we should picture ourselves in our polarized culture war society, that kind of role. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to be there in the midst of it, but we're trying to at least help people take some beginning steps to healing and wholeness. That's what we want to do, right? I'm tired of the carnage of the culture war. And I'll just be honest, every single person that I engage with that takes this paradigm, sooner or later, these vices come out. Now, my vices come out in other situations. You can ask my wife and kids, my students maybe sometimes, but when we do this, it fosters these vices and other ones. So what do we do? I've offered some suggestions, about like thinking about thicker conceptions of the virtues. Last thing, I think what I'd like to say is, what is a good Christian paradigm of political engagement? Like, what would it look like in a pluralistic society like ours? And this is a result of me, at the advice of both a Puerto Rican brother of mine and an older black brother of mine, like, as a spiritual discipline, and this goes back to the other day, the white supremacy stuff from yesterday, I would say for people like me, one really good spiritual discipline is to intentionally read the works of people on the margins. When they go to Talbot, where I did some seminary work, and others, they read my friend says this, well, I've read all your people, read some of mine. And what he means by that is what it sounds like, right? The only time I read about black theology at Talbot was a little section in a systematic theology about liberation theology and why it's heresy. That's a little truncated and misleading. All right, sorry. So the vision I want to put forward, and you can, in the paper and look it up, is just Martin Luther King's beloved community. And as I've had conversations the last few months, several other people like coming to this same thing. So I'm hoping that maybe that's something from the Spirit of God. But that's a community where it's for the flourishing of all, right? That was like an organizing vision of his, where regardless of religion, all the things that separate us, religion, sexuality, all the stuff, right? Lack of religion, that it's a community where the basic needs of everybody are met, where their basic dignity is recognized, there's racial justice, all the stuff, justice, right? That kind of society gives such a beautiful foundation and context where people actually can be formed into Christ-likeness, where we actually can love people, full stop. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Pope Francis likes to talk about the church as a field hospital. And you can't deny there are culture wars. Maybe we could be medics in the culture wars. I think that's a really provocative picture. I'm also grateful to be here, grateful for all the papers and commentaries over the last few days. I think the measure of a good workshop is I have asked questions in the last 2 days I've never asked myself before. And so I'm very much in the spirit of thinking with Mike about these things, and I'm thinking out loud and make no claims to the coherence of what follows. I do want to begin by applauding Mike Austin for naming and concretizing some specific forms of Christian behavior that should worry us. He describes this as Americanized Christianities. I think it builds on our earlier discussions about racism and white supremacy. And Mike points us to the sorts of phenomena that I'm guessing maybe occasioned the urgency of crisis language in our conference title. I don't know, I can't see into Rebecca and Steve's heads, but it seems to me that the urgency of that crisis language, I get why the problem of Christian immaturity is perennial. If you read, I remember George Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards and how frustrated Jonathan Edwards was with like 20-somethings who weren't serious about it. So I get that it's perennial, but my hunch is that we're talking about this as a crisis today, at least in part because of fault lines that cracked open in 2016. And I think probably evangelicals have a particular stake in that. It's for precisely this reason, I think Austin's paper raises some really basic questions of categories. Is immaturity the problem? Or is this really a matter of what he calls malformation? Are these synonymous? Are immaturity and malformation two names for the same thing? Or should we think of immaturity and malformation as two different, separable things? Forgive me, but in this context, I can't help but recall a jarring, almost farcical comment from a prominent evangelical leader, a leader to whom millions of families look to learn how to discipline and form their children. In June 2016, after all kinds of heinous revelations about then-candidate Trump, James Dobson explained that evangelicals should extend him some grace because he was a baby Christian. Now, I recall this not because I want to indulge in outrage, but I think it's a fascinating deployment of immaturity talk. Go easy. He's a baby Christian. And it might explain why I think I have reservations about immaturity language doing too much work. I want to say that carefully, doing too much work. Instead, I think Austin's language of malformation gets at something slightly different, even if they'll overlap. So to think alongside Mike, I want to focus on two themes. The first is constructively how we conceive or imagine Christian maturity, and this obviously we've all been trying to get a handle on this. And then secondly, how should we account for a lack of Christian maturity? More specifically, I wonder whether we need to stop worrying about just immaturity and instead focus on the real crisis, which, as Mike describes it, is mal or deformation. What difference would that make for how we might address the crisis, the problem? So first of all, how should we conceive of Christian maturity? This is a theme that's been percolating in all of our papers. I'm really grateful for the catalyst to think about this. It's kind of like Augustine on time. It's like, I know what it is right until you ask me. I have not just asked this question before. Drawing helpfully on Willard, Austin suggests that one picture of Christian maturity is we partake in the divine nature and through our actions participate in what God is doing here and now to build this kingdom. That's good. That's a good start. Pictured here is a way of life. It's a pattern of living that's characterized by vision, intention, and means. I think this is a really robust and evocative picture. It's a picture of this picture of maturity as partaking in the divine nature echoes really ancient and mystical visions of maturity in terms of union with God, as opposed to merely moralistic and behavioral criteria for maturity. I think this is one of the really surprising questions I find myself asking, given our colloquium. Is it possible and perhaps even desirable to develop a non-moralistic picture of Christian maturity? That's where I find myself. I'm not sure I'll stay here, but I'm interested in, do we need a less moralistic picture of maturity? What if Christian maturity is not synonymous with moral behavior? Or conversely, is it possible for a Christian to exhibit exemplary moral behavior and not be a mature Christian? It seems to me that the two are at least separable in some important way. I often talk about this when I'm talking to K-12 teachers or parents. Look, there are teenagers who are expert players of the moral conformity game. They know exactly how to play the moral conformity game. It is no measure of character formation. As opposed to, David Wang pointed out, you can have that obstinate, kind of difficult teenager. I love those kids because there's actually something going on, right? There's something percolating, and I want to see them in 20 years. The moral conformity players, I guess where they are in 20 years. So I don't think we want to reduce the measure of Christian maturity to just moral behavior. However, that's not to deny that character isn't somehow entwined with Christian maturity. Willard notes this, and Austin's own analysis of the vices of pride and sloth, which I think are so helpful, are really germane here. Indeed, I wonder if my colleague Rebecca DeYoung's discussion of sloth as resistance to the demands of love carries within it then a robust way to think of Christian maturity as availability to the demands of love. Austin's paper, along with others, has gotten me thinking about conceptions of Christian maturity. So we have Willard's notion of becoming partakers in the divine nature. That's a promising conceptual avenue that echoes ancient pictures of union and even theosis. Similarly, I think DeYoung's focus on availability to the demands of love ties Christian immaturity to a posture that is not merely behaviorist criteria. It might be, I have a sense that probably the pictures of maturity that we are most drawn to are reflective of the demons we know we need to exercise. And so, as an Augustinian, I find myself thinking about Christian maturity in terms of a kind of existential rest, a peaceableness, a quietude that reflects a heart that has found its home in God. So the mature Christian then is one who exhibits a kind of stability and resilience. It's the tree that has deep roots, which, yes, has the capacity to bear fruit, but it also has the capacity to sway. Great new Casey Musgrave song, by the way, Sway. That's your homework. From this place of existential rest, the mature Christian then has the mature Christian soul has the capacity to be fearless in responding to the demands of love. And just in terms of trying to be equal opportunity offenders here, because I'm so with Mike, I think, politically, but I will say this kind of picture of Christian immaturity, or of maturity, also impinges on my people on the Christian left. Because if you have this kind of maturity, you're also not going to spend all day being freaking hysterical online in outrage, right? You're not going to let yourself be carried away by the emergency, which I think that would be another form of not being mature. The mature Christian, as serene, at rest, and fearless, well, this is the picture painted by St. Teresa of Avila. In The Interior Castle, Teresa says that the telos of our spiritual quest is meeting God as the beloved and seeing ourselves as beloved of God. And crucially, she says, this is the perfect love that casts out fear. It's the perfect love that casts out fear. This attunement to the fears that lurk within us is what makes Teresa both prescient and timely. For example, she suggests that sometimes even our humility is really just a pretzeled form of fear. Because false humility is really just fear of how we are being perceived by others. So we do all this self-monitoring. This is why she says sometimes, quote, an occasion for being misunderstood or losing a bit of reputation can be a gift. And you don't even have to defend yourself. You don't have to go online. You don't have to correct them. It's an opportunity to consider whether we're willing to let go of our fear of others in order to be found in the beloved. And so I find this conception of Christian maturity asks us to require a really fundamental existential question. What are we afraid of? I think this is the culture war root, is its deep forms of fear on both sides, so to speak. What are we afraid of? I think at bottom we're afraid of being misunderstood, unseen, unrecognized, and bereft of love. We want to be known, recognized, seen, liberated, because we are loved as we are. And so Teresa's counsel is at once a scandal to the intellect and an invitation to the will. This is the line that drives philosophers crazy. Let us abandon our reason and our fear into God's hands. Let us abandon our reason and fear into God's hands. The important thing, says Teresa, is to not think much, but to love much, and so to do whatever best awakens you to love. To be loved beyond fear is to be liberated from all sorts of frantic pursuits and defensive measures. And my most charitable take on the kind of culture war posturing on both sides is it's actually frantic defense measures coming from spaces of fear. Teresa describes the fearlessness of the soul that finds herself beloved, that finds herself in the beloved. And so she's no longer frightened, she says, of every little thing. Quote, in this dwelling, she has found a place to rest at last. Maybe it's because, after all she has experienced, nothing can scare her anymore. Maybe it's because she has this constant loving companionship, and so she no longer feels alone. Storms pass quickly here, like ocean waves, and fair weather soon returns. The very opposite of Twitter. To be beloved is to be fearless. So on the yonder side of the cloud of unknowing, awash in the awareness that I am beloved, I can lay down my fears and all of my defensive weapons. Realizing I'm beloved, and here's where the social, this connects, I hope, with what Brent was saying earlier. Realizing I am beloved, I begin to see you differently. This is why it transforms into compassion and empathy and community. I begin to see you differently. A new recognition of the other stems from my self-recognition as beloved. And here is a tranquility that is the stability of one who knows they are loved. This, to me, feels like a picture of Christian maturity that isn't just synonymous with moral behavior. It would manifest itself, I guess, in virtuous ways, but it's not behavioristic. And honestly, it's a conception of maturity I find myself longing for. So we could fill out what I'm calling these conceptions of Christian maturity, and I think we should keep multiplying them. But Mike's paper also got me thinking about pictures of Christian maturity. Abstract concepts are important, but I don't think they suffice. It's equally important that we come up with pictures of Christian maturity. Think of it as an iconography of exemplars who show us what maturity looks like. Here I would urge us to expand our repertoire of icons. We shouldn't, for example, necessarily assume that Christian maturity will look evangelical. What I mean is, we should be careful that our functional pictures of maturity, sanctification, and holiness are not just modes of pietistic or revivalistic denials. Not drinking, not smoking, not dancing, not having sex standing up, because it could lead to dancing. Whatever sanctification and Christian maturity is, it's not synonymous with goody two-shoesness. And my hunch is that Christian maturity is much more about overcoming the libido dominandi, the lust for domination, than it is all of the other libidos that we spend so much time worrying about. And as Dan mentioned the first day, there is something weird and almost monstrous about the people we celebrate as saints, right? They're not normal, balanced people. These are not preppy boys and girls listening to CCM music. I think we need pictures of maturity as concrete expressions that function both as models for us, but also have an allure and a magnetism that make us say, I want to be like that. When I think of Christian maturity, several different pictures emerge. And by the way, I will also say here, thinking of like dynamics of time, It's funny, when I was in my 20s or early 20s, if you had asked me what the mature Christian looks like, it would have been goody two-shoes, not doing all of those things, and leading 14 Bible studies a week. And, do you know what I mean? It would have been all of this dutiful sort of stuff. Honestly, the self in my 20s absolutely thinks 53-year-old Jamie is backslidden. Without question. I like whiskey, I cuss a little too much, you know. But what 20-something Jamie couldn't have known is what it is to know you are beloved. And all of the liberation from all of the garbage that comes from that. And, so I think we need to think about these pictures. And now when I think of Christian maturity, here's some examples. Everybody needs their own. I think of the Dominican sisters in the Marywood community of Grand Rapids, Michigan, who have been a faithful presence for decades. They serve the poor. They protest nuclear disarmament. They are absolute badass nuns. They offer spiritual direction, and they are completely aloof to culture war posturing. Or I think of Fred Rogers, our beloved Mr. Rogers, that gentle Presbyterian who quietly and faithfully let generations of children know that they were seen and they were valued and they were loved. Or I think of John Lewis, whose Christian maturity provided the fortitude for him to endure hatred and violence while engaged in causing the good trouble that love demanded. If we were building a cathedral to incubate Christian maturity, which saints would populate the stained glass? What icons or exemplars of Christian maturity would we hold up for emulation? To whom would we want to point and say, I want to be like that? Here's the beauty of the body of Christ. Every one of your congregations has a whole host of them that none of us know. These aren't famous. You don't have to be famous to be an exemplar of Christian maturity. Okay, secondly, how does malformation happen? Very quickly. I think Austin's analysis shows us that the problem with Americanized Christianity, this crisis among us, is I don't think that this is really about immaturity. I think it's about malformation. And I want to suggest these are two things. I actually kind of want to offer two cheers for immaturity. Because there is something natural and acceptable about being immature, right? If a 2-year-old is immature, we don't hold it against them. I'd say my own growth as both a parent as a teacher has been learning to recognize the conditions of immaturity that characterize children and students. Being immature is not de facto a sin under certain conditions. It just means you're young, undeveloped. Immaturity is a deficiency of development, and such deficiency can be both understandable and acceptable given the conditions of time. To use biblical language, babies who can't chomp on a steak are not guilty. So too, Christians who have lacked opportunity to grow shouldn't necessarily be faulted for not being ready to digest the meat of Christian contemplation. Perduring immaturity, however, would be a state for which someone becomes culpable. So at what point do we become responsible for arrested development? It seems to me that what Austin analyzes not merely immaturity, but rather, as he says on the first page, spiritual malformation. Now, it might be the case that perduring immaturity makes us more susceptible to malformation. I'm guessing that's probably almost certainly the case. But I think what has long worried me is the extent to which Christians who might check a number of boxes for at least some version of Christian maturity can nonetheless be assimilated to deformative expressions of their faith, especially in the public sphere, it seems like. So, I've said lots of things elsewhere about how formation, malformation, and habituation takes place. I'll say this. I'm intrigued by where Mike goes with this. He emphasizes the need to meditate on thick conceptions of the virtues, and I agree that this is a part of the strategy of resistance and counterformation. This conception of meditation On thick conceptions, however, I think maybe in Mike's paper it tends towards analysis, which is good. I'm pro-analysis. I would just add another kind of contemplation and meditation, which is meditating on pictures of Christian maturity. In other words, I think such meditation should also engage the imagination. So I want to, again, just emphasize the agreement. I think critical, rational reflection on these dynamics is part of defanging deformative liturgies. But then I also think there's a kind of contemplation of these pictures that is more on the register of the imagination. Such captivation happens on the register of the imagination as much as the intellect. So one kind of meditation on thick conceptions of the virtues might look like philosophical and theological analysis, it should, but another kind might look like a novel or a film or a biography of Dorothy Day. I already know the kind of grandfather I want to be because I met Reverend John Ames in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, and this is a deep cut. Zeke on Parenthood. Did anybody watch Parenthood? I just want to be, I'm going to call all my kids grandson. The Christian tradition has long emphasized that a key mode of habituation involves mimesis, imitation, imitating Christ and imitating those who have imitated Christ for us. When I imagine the sort of Christian I hope to be, I picture Mr. Rogers. He models Christ-likeness, gentle, compassionate, attentive, patient, loving, in a way I find deeply affecting. He is an icon of Christian maturity, which is to say he is a little Christ that helps me imagine how I might be more like Christ.